They called it Alesia, the fortress that could never fall, a city of stone perched on a high plateau between two rivers, with cliffs so steep that even goats hesitated to climb them. From its ramparts, one could see the valleys for miles, their fields now blackened by the war that had devoured all of Gaul. To its people, it was the heart of their last hope. To Julius Caesar, it was the mouth of a trap he had been preparing for years. For 7 years, Gaul had resisted Rome with fury and fire. The legions had cut through forests and mountains, burning villages, enslaving tribes, and crucifying those who refused to kneel. But resistance had always rekindled small rebellions like sparks in dry grass until one man gathered them into a single flame. His name was Vercingetorix, son of a murdered chieftain, exiled warrior turned messiah. He united fractious tribes under a promise to drive Rome back beyond the Alps or die in the attempt. At first it worked. The Gallic cavalry, fierce and fast, shattered Roman patrols. At Gergovia, Caesar suffered one of his few true defeats, losing nearly 1,000 men and his reputation for invincibility. The Gauls sang that the gods had returned, but Rome's power was not born from gods, it was born from patience. Caesar withdrew not in panic but in calculation. He studied his enemies' movements, the routes of their supply lines, the distances between their allies. When Vercingetorix retreated toward the hill fort of Alesia, heavy with civilians, carts, and stores of grain, Caesar smiled. The trap had baited itself. The march to Alesia was brutal. The Gallic host, nearly 80,000 warriors trudged up the steep roads, followed by tens of thousands of women, children, and elders. They believed the high walls and surrounding rivers made them untouchable. The Romans followed close behind, not in wild pursuit, but with the mechanical inevitability of a tide that knows where the shore must end. By late summer, Caesar's legion stood on the plains below, measuring the land with their eyes. The plateau of Alesia rose like an island from a sea of grass. 2 rivers, the Aurane and the O, curled around its base, leaving only narrow approaches from the west and east. To the Gauls, it seemed a perfect fortress. To Caesar, it was a gift from Mars himself. They have imprisoned themselves, he said to his officers. We will close the lid. The next morning, the order went out. Dig. Tens of thousands of men picked up spades, axes, and shovels. The sound of iron on earth filled the valley, not the chaos of battle, but the rhythm of creation. It was said that Romans could build faster than others could die, and that every trench they dug was a prophecy. By sunset, the outline of the first wall had begun to take shape, a ring that would strangle a nation. Vercingetorix watched from the walls as the Romans marked the fields below with stakes and flags. At first, he thought they were preparing a temporary camp. Then he saw how far the line extended, curving around the foothills, past the river over the horizon. It was not a camp, it was a noose. When scouts returned with reports that Caesar had brought 60 men and every engineer he possessed, realizations set in. Alesia, once a refuge, had become a tomb. Inside the city, the Gallic leaders argued. Some wanted to charge now, break the Romans before their defenses hardened. Others warned that Caesar's trenches were already deep, and his cavalry patrolled every exit. Vercingetorix calmed them. Let him build. He said, we have food, water, and walls. When his men starve in the field, we will crush them between hunger and steel. It was a plan built on pride, and on the belief that Gaul was still one. For while Alesia was trapped, Caesar's messengers were already riding across the countryside. Every Roman ally, every grain convoy, every provincial garrison received orders. Block every road, burn every barn, cut every bridge. The hunters had become the hunted, But Caesar knew that isolation worked both ways. The same mountains that trapped him with 80,000 enemies also kept reinforcements from reaching Alesia. This was no ordinary siege. It was a duel of endurance, and one side would starve before the other. By the end of the first week, the Romans had built more than 11 mi of continuous fortifications, ditches 20 ft wide, ramparts 15 ft high, 23 forts with towers spaced at precise intervals. The Gallic cavalry launched skirmishes to harass the workers, but every charge was met by disciplined counterfire and iron discipline. Slowly, methodically, the walls closed like a tightening fist. Above, the people of Alesia lit their fires and waited. Below, the legions worked through night and storm. Between them hung a silence heavy with fate. The Gauls prayed to gods of earth and sky, to spirits of mountain and forest. The Romans prayed to none, only to the strength of their own hands. By the time the first leaves began to turn red, the valley around Alesia was gone. In its place stood a vast human machine, wooden towers, trenches, stakes, and walls, a perfect circle of death. Caesar's lieutenants warned him that the enemy's allies would come. He nodded. Let them come. He said, "We will build another wall." And thus, beneath the shadow of the Gallic stronghold, began the most impossible siege in history. A siege within a siege, where those who besieged were themselves besieged, and the land of Gaul held its breath between two nations, fighting for the right to exist. The ground trembled with the rhythm of tools. Pickaxes struck stone, shovels tore at clay, wooden carts groaned under the weight of earth that once belonged to the gods. To watch the Romans at work was to see a new species of warfare, a silence of industry instead of the roar of glory. They fought not with charge or clash, but with patience, precision, and the belief that sweat could conquer what blood could not. The first wall, called the circumvallation, was drawn around Alesia like the line of a knife pressed to skin. It stretched 11 mi, a perfect loop of ditches, towers, and palisades, an artificial horizon visible from the Gallic ramparts. In front of it, two great trenches ran parallel, each 20 ft wide. The first was filled with water diverted from the rivers below, turning the earth itself into a moat. The second was left dry, to trap and break legs before the spears above could finish the work. Behind them rose the rampart, 15 ft of timber, clay, and stone, topped with sharpened stakes that pointed toward the sky like frozen lightning. At measured intervals stood 23 forts, each one a miniature city armed with catapults, ballistae, and signal fires that blinked like the eyes of some enormous sleepless beast. Between them, causeways carried couriers, carts, and soldiers who patrolled ceaselessly. The entire construction was a living creature. Veins of supply, lungs of smoke, a heart that beat to the sound of Caesar's discipline. But Vercingetorix, watching from his high perch, understood what was coming. If the Romans could trap Alesia, then Gaul itself would suffocate. He gathered his chieftains in the great hall, its pillars carved with the symbols of tribes that had not always been allies. Around the fire they debated, attack now or wait. Some demanded a night raid, arguing that fear itself would shatter Roman discipline. Others urged patience, pointing to the granaries, still full, and to the hills that could not be climbed without death. Vercingetorix listened in silence. He knew Caesar. He had fought him, fled from him, outsmarted him, and each time Caesar had adapted colder, faster, tireless. At last he spoke, "We will hold, and when our brothers come from every tribe in Gaul, we will crush them between hammer and anvil." The Romans had no illusions. They knew that reinforcements would come. Caesar's lieutenants pressed him for retreat, but he dismissed the thought. Instead, he ordered a second miracle. The outer wall, the contravallation, would encircle the encirclers. 14 mi outward, facing the plains of Gaul, the legions began again. 2 lines of trenches, more towers, more stakes, more death. Between these twin fortresses, 60 zeros, 0 Romans and thousands of camp followers now lived, fought, and waited, trapped inside their own creation. If either wall fell, the other would not save them. There was nowhere to run. The construction became an act of worship not to gods but to geometry. Each wall segment was measured to the inch, each tower to the span of a javelin throw. Caesar himself rode the perimeter daily, his red cloak visible above the ramparts, his face calm as if inspecting a monument rather than a battlefield. To his soldiers, he seemed more architect than general, a man building eternity with human lives as bricks. Meanwhile, the Gauls inside Alesia watched their world shrink. At first, they jeered at the Romans, shouting insults across the trenches, firing arrows that fell short, mocking the endless digging. But when the second wall appeared, stretching outward toward the horizon, the laughter faded. From the walls they could see smoke from Roman forges, smell the tar and pitch of their fortifications, and hear the deep thuds of rams driving stakes into earth. A city meant to be unassailable was now a prison. Then came hunger. The granaries that had seemed ample began to empty. Grain was rationed, horses were slaughtered. When the dogs disappeared, no one asked where they had gone. Vercingetorix ordered all non-combatants, the women, the old, the children, to leave the city to save food for the warriors. 40,000 souls filed down the steep road carrying nothing but despair. They expected mercy. Instead, they met Caesar's iron law. No one passed the walls. For days they waited between the lines, a sea of starving humanity trapped in the space between life and death. The Romans refused to open their gates. The Gauls inside refused to take them back. Their cries echoed day and night, a constant wailing carried by the wind. The Romans tried not to listen, but sound travels where courage cannot reach. Soldiers joked to hide their pity, but at night some prayed to their foreign gods for silence. The dead began to pile near the ditches. Some said the living had begun to eat the bodies. Others said they had seen mothers smother their infants to spare them another sunrise. Caesar did not flinch. He knew that pity was contagion. His soldiers learned to step over corpses on their patrols, and to eat in silence while the wind carried the smell of death from between the walls. Then came the first probing attacks. Small groups of Gauls crept down from the plateau under moonlight, testing the ditches, throwing planks and brush to cross the trenches. Arrows met them before they reached the palisade. Roman sentries lit tread bundles and hurled them down the slopes, turning night into a red day. The shadows of men burned on the walls like ghosts pinned to the earth. By dawn, the hillside was littered with blackened armor and broken shields. But Vercingetorix was not beaten. Every defeat was a message, a signal fire lit to the tribes beyond the horizon. His riders had escaped the encirclement before it closed, carrying word of his peril. Across Gaul, war horns began to sound from the Arvery and the Carnutes, from the Iadi and the Senons, from forests and marshes and distant hills. An army was rising. Hundreds of thousands would soon march to Alesia's rescue. The Romans, when they learned this, did not panic. They built faster, more towers, more traps, more pits filled with sharpened stakes they called Sippi and Lilia, the lees of death. The ground itself became a weapon. The fortress grew not upward but outward, an architecture of annihilation. By now, the valley around Alesia no longer looked like land. It looked like a wound carved into the world. Inside the city, the Gauls began to pray louder. Outside, the Romans waited with eyes fixed on the horizon. Between them lay the corpses of the forgotten 40,000 witnesses who had died without sides. And beyond the hills the sound was coming, the first thunder of hooves, the whisper of armies gathering. The siege had become something monstrous, a living paradox, an army trapped inside its own trap, a city devouring itself, and a world watching to see which would starve first. The body of Rome, or the soul of Gaul. The first sign was dust, not the thin veil that rose from daily patrols, but a wall of it, thick and golden, rolling across the horizon like a tide of smoke. Roman lookouts on the outer towers stared in silence, and the cry passed down the line, "They are coming!" From the ramparts of Alesia, the Gauls erupted in shouts of joy. Their horns blared across the valley, echoing against the cliffs, answered by faint calls from far beyond the hills. Hope, that most dangerous of weapons, returned to the besieged. When the storm reached the plain, it had a 100 zeros, 0 faces. The Gallic relief army stretched farther than sight, warriors painted blue and white, shields marked with the sigils of every tribe still free. Behind them rode nobles on tall horses, cloaks snapping in the wind, spears gleaming like a field of ice. Their songs rolled across the plains, fierce and defiant. For the first time in months, the people of Alesia dared to believe they might live. Caesar stood upon a tower on the outer wall and watched it all. His officers gathered below, some whispering of retreat, others clutching their swords as if the gesture itself could hold back a nation. But Caesar's face did not move. The geometry was his ally. He knew his walls, his trenches, his traps. He saw not a tide of men, but the points where that tide would break. When at last he spoke, his voice carried through the wind like an order from stone. "Hold your ground." The Gallic host halted on the plain. Scouts returned with reports of the double fortifications, the endless line of stakes, ditches, and towers. What they saw defied reason, an entire city of war built by human hands. The chieftains argued, attack now or wait for exhaustion to weaken the Romans. But the warriors' blood was hot, and the sight of their starving kin upon the walls of Alesia demanded vengeance. At sunset, the horn sounded and the plain moved. The first assault came like thunder. Thousands of cavalry charged the flanks, trampling the earth, while waves of infantry followed with ladders, planks, and shields locked tight. Arrows hissed from the Roman towers. Great stones launched by catapults tore through ranks and vanished into red mist. The trenches swallowed the front lines. Men fell upon the lees, those hidden pits with sharpened stakes, and vanished screaming. Still they came on, trampling their wounded, crossing on bridges of corpses. The outer ditch filled with blood and mud until it became a red mirror reflecting the towers above. For hours the legions held their discipline, the only thing standing between order and chaos. They fought in silence, breathing through their teeth, passing javelins forward as calmly as builders passed bricks. When the assault finally broke and the Gauls withdrew, the Romans did not cheer. They rebuilt what had burned, reset the stakes, wiped the blood from their armor, and waited for night. Caesar knew the next attack would come when the stars appeared. It came sooner. Under the light of a half-moon, the Gauls struck again, this time coordinated with the besieged inside Alesia. From the plateau above, Vercellix's men poured down the slopes, torches strapped to their shields, shouting war cries to drown out fear. Inside the Roman lines, horns blared in warning as thousands of soldiers sprinted from tower to tower, defending in two directions at once. Arrows fell from the sky like rain. Torches burned, trenches dry. The air became a storm of ash and screaming. The Romans fought on instinct now, each man a cog in a living wall. Those on the inner rampart saw the silhouettes of Gauls leaping the ditches, their axes flashing, their breath steaming in the cold. The two armies met atop the palisade, blades catching firelight, faces unrecognizable in soot and blood. When one side fell, the other climbed over the dead to take its place. The outer walls echoed with the same carnage, the relief force throwing itself against the stakes, testing every weak spot, retreating and surging again. In the narrow corridor between the walls, runners carried desperate orders from Caesar's aides: shift cohorts, reinforce towers, move reserves. By dawn, thousands lay dead in the mud. Neither side had gained an inch. Smoke drifted low over the valley, and the smell of burnt flesh carried up to Alesia's walls. Inside the city, mothers pressed their children's faces into their shawls so they wouldn't hear the screams rising from both directions. Then came the third day, the day when everything that had been built, prayed for, or feared would be decided. At dawn, fog rolled through the valley, soft and white, hiding both camps. The Gauls outside took it as a blessing from their gods. Hidden by the mist, they moved silently toward the western sector, where the hills dipped and the trenches narrowed. The Roman scouts caught no warning. When the fog thinned, the assault was already underway. 60,000 warriors hurled themselves against the rampart at Mount Raya, where the ground rose unevenly and the walls were thinner. They came in waves, ladders clattering against wood, shields locked overhead. From the opposite side, the defenders of Alesia attacked again, hurling javelins and stones from the heights. For the first time, the Romans began to buckle. Cohorts bent backward under sheer pressure, shields splintering, men crushed against their own towers. Caesar, watching from his command post, understood at once. He ordered every reserve to that point, the 10th Legion in the center, the 13th and 14th from the flanks, and his Germanic cavalry to circle wide through the hills. Trumpets blared, their notes cutting through the chaos. The fog lifted, revealing a battlefield that looked like the mouth of hell. The Romans surged forward with machine precision. Officers shouted the ancient commands: Pellam, Gladius, scoot them, and the lines obeyed as one. The first volley of javelins hit the advancing Gauls like a wave of lightning. Those who survived met the short Roman swords in the trenches. The fighting was so close that men could feel the breath of the ones killing them. Spears snapped, shields shattered, and bodies fell in piles that became obstacles of their own. Above, on the slopes, Vercingetorix's army roared and threw itself into the melee. The inner wall was nearly breached. Roman archers fired point-blank into faces below them. Caesar himself rode to the weakest sector, the crimson cloak of command blazing against the gray sky. His presence steadied the lines. Men saw him and stood taller. At the outer wall, the relief army finally broke through the first ditch. Trumpets screamed for a heartbeat. It seemed the Romans would collapse. Then the thunder of hooves erupted from beyond the ridge. The Germanic cavalry returning from their flanking maneuver. They smashed into the Gauls' rear like a hammer into glass. Panic spread faster than flame. The front ranks faltered, then wavered, then ran from the city. Vercingetorix watched his brothers die. He ordered one last charge, hurling every man who could still stand against the Roman inner line. It was madness, and he knew it, but he had nothing else left to give. The slopes of Alesia became a single moving mass of men and fire. Below, the Romans fought like creatures possessed. The air filled with the clang of iron and the whine of arrows. Even the wounded crawled to strike one more blow before the light faded. By sunset, the valley had turned red. The relief army was in full retreat, trampled beneath its own. The inner assault ceased as word spread through Alesia. Their salvation was dead. On the plain below, the Romans did not pursue. They were too exhausted to cheer, too haunted to rejoice. The sky glowed orange with the fires of burning siege towers. The wind carried the cries of the dying across the no-man's land, mixing with the rustle of vultures descending. In 3 days, the greatest army Gaul had ever assembled had ceased to exist. The trap had closed, and this time it was the world that was inside it. When the last trumpet fell silent, the valley of Alesia became a graveyard without boundaries. Smoke drifted low over the fields where the relief army had been, settling over bodies still twitching in the fading light. The rivers below ran thick and slow, carrying with them the blood of thousands who had believed the gods would save them. The wind was gentle again, but it carried no life, only the whisper of flies beginning their work. On the plateau above, the people of Alesia stood upon the walls and saw what the sun had revealed. The armies that had promised them freedom were gone. Hope had marched toward them and died before their eyes. Inside the city, the noise of despair was quieter than battle. The warriors who had survived threw down their weapons and sat in silence. Mothers searched the faces of the wounded for sons they would never find. Even the priests ceased their chants. Their gods had no more answers to give. Hunger, which had been a constant whisper, now became a scream in the stomachs of every living soul. The horses were gone, the dogs were gone. The last stores of grain had been rationed 3 days before. Now there was nothing left to wait for but death, and the question of whose hand would deliver it. Pillow, the Romans worked as if nothing extraordinary had happened. They buried their dead in ordered trenches, counted their weapons, repaired the breaches in the ramparts. The precision that had built the double walls now built order out of carnage. Caesar himself moved among them, wordless and pale. He did not smile, for he knew that victory in such a place could not be clean. Every Roman who had fought in those 3 days carried in his eyes the same haunted glaze. Men who had stared into the center of chaos and seen their own reflection staring back. By the second dawn after the battle, Alesia's gates remained closed. Though the defenders no longer manned the walls the Romans waited, they knew what silence meant. Then, as the mist rose, the gates creaked open. A single figure rode out tall, cloaked in crimson and bronze, the light catching his hair like fire. Vercingetorix came forward alone. Through the field of death his dream had made. He did not bring a weapon. His horse's hooves splashed through the shallow ditches, filled with rain and blood. He reached the Roman camp, dismounted, and walked the rest of the way. The soldiers parted before him in silence, seeing not an enemy, but something larger, the ghost of a nation collapsing into one man. He came before Caesar's tent and stopped. For a long time, neither moved. There were no words left between them. The air carried only the groan of the wind and the rattle of distant armor. Then Vercingetorix drew the sword that had once united 100 tribes, turned it in his hands as if seeing it for the first time, and dropped it at Caesar's feet. The sound was not loud, yet it carried across the camp like the closing of a door. It was the sound of Gaul dying. That day, Alesia opened its gates. The warriors filed out first, silent, unarmed, faces hollow from weeks of hunger. Behind them came the women and the children, their eyes sunken, their steps small. The Romans stood in ranks as they passed, their armor gleaming, their expressions unreadable. No one cheered. It was not a triumph, but a funeral. The conquered walked among the conquerors, and the air between them was so heavy that even birds would not fly through it. Caesar ordered the captives divided. The nobles were set aside for ransom, the common soldiers for slavery. Each legionary received at least one prisoner, a living token of victory. Those too weak to walk were left to die where they fell. The plain became a silent procession of human shadows, disappearing into the distance. In the ditches between the walls, the bodies of the unburied civilians remained. their faces turned upward, as if still waiting for an answer that would never come. When night fell, torches lined the Roman camps, burning steady and straight. The light reached the ruins of the Galaxy city where no fires burned in return. The plateau of Alicia was dark at last. Some said that from the walls one could hear the faint cry of flutes, the last priests of the tribe singing to the dead. Others swore that the mountain itself sighed, not in wind, but in sorrow. What had begun as rebellion had become extinction. In the following days, the legions dismantled their outer fortifications and gathered their wounded. The trenches were filled with earth and stone, but the inner walls they left standing, a monument to Roman ingenuity and Gic despair. The farmers who would later till that soil would find shards of spearheads, nails from sandals, and bones that crumbled like chalk in their hands. The land would remember long after men had forgotten. Caesar recorded the victory in his commentary, calling it the end of the JC War. But his words could not capture the stench of the dead, nor the silence of the living who followed him south. Alesia had been more than a battle, it had been a transformation. The tribes that had once roamed free across forests and plains were now subjects of an empire that measured time in triumphs. Their gods would fade, their languages would blend, and their sons would one day fight in Roman armor, far from the land where their fathers had fallen. Yet even Rome could not erase the echo of that place. When storms passed over the hills, shepherds swore they could hear the clash of iron and the cry of dying horses. When mists rose from the rivers, they said it was the souls of the 40 zeros, who had starved between the walls. And when travelers crossed the valley at dusk, they sometimes found the ground uneven, as if the earth itself still breathed beneath their feet. So ended the siege of Alesia, not with fire or glory, but with a slow exhalation from a world that had watched itself end. The Romans departed, leaving behind their walls, their pits, and their perfection. The Gauls who survived followed them, shackled to their conquerors or to memory. The wind took the ashes, the rivers carried the blood, and the mountain stood alone.